keeping our word. When we take a vow to God, we're not dealing with our neighbor. We're not dealing with the man who lives next door to us. We're dealing with God. We're not even dealing with our wife or our husband or our brother or our sister or uncle or aunt. No, when we make a vow to God, we're dealing with God. And we should only vow to do those things that, that we know that we can fulfill, carry out. Solomon, the wise man, makes this statement in Ecclesiastes 5, verses 4 and 5. When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldest not vow than thou shouldest vow and not pay. And amen. Now, let me mention a couple of Psalms in regard to this study. Psalm 56, verse 12, it says, Thy vows are upon me, O God. I will render praises unto thee. And then Psalm 61, verse 8, So will I sing praise unto thy name forever, that I may daily perform my vows. Now, vows are discussed, as we mentioned, in Leviticus 27, and it's also that we dealt with back yonder in chapter 6 of Numbers. But the vows in this chapter 30 of Numbers, are different. Here, the stipulations that are given don't deal with the kind of vow that we take or would make, but it places emphasis on the importance of keeping a vow. So it's not being specific on any one particular kind of vow, as it's referred to in other places like Leviticus 27. But this one is, again, there are vows that we need to make. We're making it to God. And here in this chapter, stipulations don't deal with the kind of vow that we could make, but place emphasis on the importance. Let me get this straightened out here. It's dealing with the importance of vow, not the kind of vow necessarily. Let me continue with verse 3 as an example. If a woman also vow a vow unto the Lord and bind herself by a bond, being in her father's house in her youth, verse 4, and her father hear her vow and her bond wherewith she hath bound her soul, and her father shall hold his peace at her, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand. So here it's dealing with a female. The Nazarite that we dealt with in chapter 6, they made this kind of vow, this type of vow. A Nazarite vow was often for a specific or specified period of time. An example of a lifelong Nazarite is that we read about in Judges chapter 13, concerning Samson. His wasn't just for a temporary period of time, but was for a lifetime. Now, Rabbi Kaplan, that we have quoted from several times, Rabbi Kaplan, however it should be pronounced, he writes, from age 11 until 12 and a half, before that age, the vows are not binding, and later her father can no longer annul them. So he's dealing here with a female, a daughter in her father's house. If she makes a vow, then it only is dealing with a child, or 11 to 13 or 12 and a half, as Mr. Kaplan says. And then in verse 5 and 6, it goes on to describe, but if her father disallow her in the day that he heareth not any of her vows or of her bonds wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand, and the Lord shall forgive her, because her father disallowed her. And if she had at all an husband, when she vowed or uttered aught out of her lips, wherewith she bound her soul, and her husband heard it, and held his peace at her in the day that he heard it, then her vows shall stand, and her bonds wherewith she bound her soul shall stand. But, verse 8, but if her husband disallowed her on the day that he heard it, then she shall make her vow which she vowed, and that which she uttered with her lips, wherewith she bound her soul, of none effect, and the Lord shall forgive her. So it's dealing here with not only age-wise, but also the person that's involved. In verses 6, 7, and 8 here, it's referring to married women, which were under the law, as unmarried young women, for at least equally cogent reasons. And let me quote Pfeiffer. He makes an interesting comment on this subject here. He says, women were largely untaught concerning the details of religious ceremony, and therefore could make rash pledges or vows harmful to their husbands' households. A disaffected wife might purposely make a vow or pledge that would injure her husband. So his legal ability to invalidate his wife's oath protected his estate, since a vow might include the payment of a large sum. If the vow was the kind that placed an affliction or prohibition on the wife, the husband was free to validate the vow and to share this burden, and so share this burden, or to veto it. The end of quote. So this particular portion of our study here in this chapter deals with married women, and in that day, well, it still takes place in some areas of our world. Those marriage ladies or women sometimes were just teenagers, very young teenagers, and not qualified, not educated enough, not familiar enough with the affairs of life and the responsibilities of life, that they could blurt out a vow, a promise that again, if their husband is around and hears it, or even maybe is only told about it later, then he could annul it. So anyway, it also lets us know and emphasizes the condition of womanhood of the women, females in that period of time. They were secondary. Let me put it that way. They were secondary when it came to business affairs or lifestyles and promises and so on. They were under the jurisdiction and watch care, as it were, of their husband. And so if they make a promise that the husband doesn't agree with, he can annul it. Let me one more quote that applies here. And Allen, the commentator, he says, this is a protective clause. It also works for her in that she might have been pressured into making a vow that was not at all in her best interest to keep. This provision frees her from unnecessary complications to her life as well, in both the case of the married woman and the woman who lives with her father. The vows may be released by another, but only if he acts immediately on the information he has. That's Mr. Allen's view or thoughts concerning this. So it's an interesting situation and teaching here concerning the law involving vows, making promises. Let me read on, let me read 3 more verses 9, 10, and 11. But every vow of a widow and of her that is divorced, wherewith they have bound their souls, shall stand against her. And if she vowed in her husband's house, or bound her soul by a bond with an oath, and her husband heard it, and held his peace at her, and disallowed her not, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she bound her soul shall stand. So again, dealing with particularities. A widow or a divorced woman, obviously, she has no male head, no man looking over her and guiding her and governing her. Of course, her head is God directly, and she's still bound by her vows. If there's no husband, then God is taking consideration or taking thoughts of what she is saying. Now, again, let me borrow from Kaplan, because he's the Jewish expert, shall we say, that is familiar with these laws and regulations. He said, once a woman enters her husband's house, she is considered fully married and is no longer under her father's control. The wedding canopy is a symbolic home into which her husband brings her. The husband can annul the vows of his wife even when she is an adult. The end of quote. So Mr. Kaplan is telling us, even putting it in my understanding of what he's saying, that it doesn't matter how old she is. If she's just a 16-year-old, then her husband is in control. Or if they've been married for 50 years, the husband's 80 years old, and she's 60 years old or whatever, or 80 years old, he is still in control of her vow and can say yes or no to what she has promised. And then in verse 12, it says, but if her husband hath utterly made them void on the day he heard them, then whatsoever proceeded out of her lips concerning her vows or concerning the bond of her soul shall not stand. Her husband hath made them void, and the Lord shall forgive her. The Lord shall forgive her. This as well, stop and think about what this verse is telling us. But if her husband, then when she was in her own power, by his death or by a divorce, she was not bound to make her promises good, but because when she made her husband, whose power she was under control then, could utterly void them, make them void. But the point that to me in this verse that stands out is the last phrase, the Lord shall forgive her. Again, we're not dealing with husbands and wives altogether. We're dealing with wives and God. Our vow is to God. And if there's not the authority or power of the husband around, she is still bound by God to the promise that she has made. And again and again, we could go on and on to realize and acknowledge the fact and emphasize the point that what we say, what's coming out of our mouth, we better make sure what we say before we say it. We can utter something in a, nervous moment that just pops out, and it can be a dangerous thing to do. Making vows, we need to know what we're saying. I was thinking of an old expression that I remember hearing many years ago. If I can remember it just exactly, but he said, it says something like, the tongue is in a slippery place, and we better make sure that our foot is on the brake before we turn loose of the clutch. No, that's not right, but something like that. Our tongue is in a slippery place, so we better make sure of what we're going to say before we release the clutch. In other words, put it in gear. Of course, when I say clutch, I'm thinking back when I first heard that old expression many years ago when we didn't have automatic transmissions. But anyway, our tongue is in a slippery place, and sometimes we get excited or we get stirred up about something, and we can say things that we later regret saying. So again, God help us. God help us. Now, in verse 13, every vow and every binding oath to afflict the soul, her husband may establish it, or her husband may make it void. Now, this expression afflict, to afflict the soul, the expression, it's, I think, more properly to mean humble. The case here may be that the woman would take a religious vow, for instance, on an occasion to humble herself, to mortify her flesh, to abstain from certain things. And perhaps the indication or references to a sexual relation within the marriage. Again, our feelings can get in the way of our mouth sometimes. In verse 14, but if her husband altogether hold his peace at her from day to day, then he establisheth all her vows or all her bonds which are upon her. He confirmeth them because he held his peace at her in the day that he heard them. So again, the word, the law, is touching on so many different details here about promises, vows. Let me one more time refer to Rabbi Kaplan. While the father of a young girl can annul any vow, a husband can only annul a vow that involves self-denial. It does not matter how minor the self-denial is. Any self-denial on the part of the wife will ultimately affect the husband. However, others maintain that the father also can annul only vows that involve self-denial. The end of quote. If we understand what this passage is dealing with. In verse 15, but if he shall say, shall anyways make them void after that he hath heard them, then he shall bear her iniquity. My. On and on we could go. This chapter is again dealing, it seems like, so meticulously with the subject of vows. But anyway, he shall hear her iniquity means that he will suffer for the broken vow as though it were his, if he doesn't handle it properly. Verse 16, these are the statutes which the Lord commanded Moses between a man and his wife, between the father and his daughter, being yet in her youth in her father's house. So the vows that spoken by her with different groups regarding their vows, their promises to Yahweh. It deals with a husband and his wife, a father and his daughter, as well as a daughter that goes back home. Maybe her husband's died, and she goes back home or whatever. Now, this word that we have read here again and again, vow, the word vow, is only found used twice, 2 times in the New Testament. And let me share with you what I wrote on those two passages that are in the book of Acts. First of all, Acts chapter 18 and verse 18. And Paul, after this, tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria. And with him Priscilla and Aquila, having showed his hand in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. So there's some debate here among commentators as to whether this is talking about Paul or is he talking about Aquila that made this vow. And I'm of the opinion that it was Paul that's in reference to it. And again, we can go back in the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 6, to find what the law had to say about someone that made such a vow. So what was Paul doing, making such a vow? I'm reading from my commentary on the book of Acts. What was Paul doing, making such a vow? The purpose of the vow of the Nazirite was to express a unique consecration to God, promising to abstain from all products from the grapevine, to not cut one's hair, and to never come near a dead body. So what was Paul doing, making such a vow? Why did he do it at this particular time? And I quoted in my commentary, William Barclay. He suggested, no doubt Paul was thinking of all God's goodness to him in Corinth and took this vow to show his gratitude. The end of quote. Well, this is the only place in the New Testament where we have Paul, a reference to Paul making such a commitment, such a vow. The purpose of the vow, it may have more than one consecration with thanksgiving. Perhaps the intense worldliness of Corinth made Paul want to express his dedication and his separation to the Lord more than ever before, shall I say. And then the second place, and I'm again looking at my commentary comments, in the second place, it's found in the book of Acts 21 and verse 23, where we read, do therefore this that we say to thee, we have 4 men which have a vow on them. So this was request by the elders of the church at Jerusalem, raises some issues as to how far do we go in trying to appease those who oppose us in our beliefs. What the elders are proposing is for the purpose of trying to show these unruly Jews that the church continues to observe certain laws and has not turned its back completely on the law. How did their suggestion work out for Paul and for the church? The question. The vow in reference must have been that of the Nazirite in regard to the shaving of the hair that we read about in the next verse in 21 here. The actions of Paul are a lesson for us in this day, working with people. I'm thinking particularly of those in other countries, to not offend them in practices that have nothing to do with doctrine or salvation. There was nothing in these actions of Paul that compromised the message of salvation which he preached. But his actions could possibly offer him an opportunity to speak to them about the church if he can defuse their attitude that is presently against his doctrine. The end of quote. Well, that's again what we wrote in our commentary. But anyway, we still regardless of the fact we're in the 21st century, and regardless we're not under the law in the sense and the respect of what we're reading here in the book of Numbers that deals with so many issues that are not related to us, such as the sacrifices and the blood and whatever. But in the subject, with the subject of vows, it's just as real today and just as important today, and we're just as liable today as in that century. When we make a promise, we should keep that promise. Call it a vow, call it a promise. We're bound by what we say. So again, repeating myself, we should think a while before we, especially when we're dealing with a serious matter, well, in any matter, but particularly a serious matter, we need to, before we sign that document, before we make that statement, we ought to think about it. We ought to think about it. God, help us not to say something and then later regret that we said it. But at the same time, if we say something and later regret it, we should be strong enough, spiritual enough to ask for forgiveness. That's one of the tough words for us to be able to say, forgive me. But it's important. If you said something you shouldn't have said, we need to ask forgiveness. And that should not be something that's hard for us as a child of God. Make sure, I want my record right. I want my record clean. So let's make sure. Let's make sure. And so we can stand before God with a clean slate, if you will, or a clean record. Amen. God bless you. This winds it up one more evening. We look forward to being with you again, the Lord willing, and tarrying tomorrow evening. May God smile on you, Brother Michael, and your home, the church at Dewa. God bless.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you. See you tomorrow.
Good Lord willing. Amen.